Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So we have a short cast tonight. I mean, we're both kind of tall, but you can't tell that from the internet. So with me, Mike Christensen. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing very well, and I'm 6'7".
Exactly. He's like 6'7", and what would you say, 270 pounds?
Yes.
Basically, you're a power forward in the NBA.
Yeah. This door is 9 feet tall.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's all a matter of perspective. You set the camera up the right way, and everything looks weird. So, in case this is your first time here, welcome to Shop Talk. Normally, I sound a little bit better than this, but just got back from a flight today and probably got some con cruft, which actually will be related to our first topic of the night. Anders, by the way, says as if, probably related to how tall we are, mostly because Anders is jealous.
It's not
So
easy being 6'7". I have to find special clothes.
that's true. That's true. I mean, everybody gets their clothes tailor made, right?
That's right.
So, in case this is your first time here at Shop Talk, basically it's Monday. Work is probably over. We're kicking back and just enjoying uh, some time together. Talk a little bit about SQL Server, data platform technologies. If you have questions, drop them in chat. Welcome in. Welcome back, I should say. Good to see you again. So, topic number one for the night. Data Relay. Data Relay was last week. That is a 5-day conference in 5 cities across the UK. Specifically, they mostly stick to England. Every once in a while, they'll go down to Cardiff, but generally, it's in England. They're sometimes they'll go to Scotland as well. But this year, day number one was in the National Computer Museum in Bletchley, so Bletchley
Cool.
Park. And that was actually kind of cool because they showed off a working reconstruction of Colossus, which was the first digital computer. And for about 30 years, that was a secret that nobody was supposed to know about outside of a few members of the British government, a few members of the Royal Navy, and people along those lines. So for decades, the story was that I think it was DEC who was supposed to have created the first digital computer. And then in 1975, when the Secrets Act expired for those 1945 documents, the British government basically said, oh, by the way, about that. So somebody had rebuilt this in the 90s, and there is a working version of it available at the National Computer Museum in Bletchley.
Wow.
I dropped a link to it in chat, but this was not for decrypting Enigma. So this was not Ultra. This was actually a second. It was the Lorentz cipher that the Germans had used. And the real interesting part about that was the Lorentz cipher was broken. If I remember right, it was broken within about a month of it actually coming into play by a Polish mathematician. And for about a decade, people had to hand break things manually. So it took one or several days to crack one message. And then this digital computer came about to speed up the process and got it down to 20 minutes to know if you can decrypt this message and about 1 hour to decrypt it. Nonetheless, there's a whole story about it. It was kind of fun listening to one of the people at the museum talking about it. Anders calls it fake news. I did see it in person. I did actually see them running it, so I can tell you it actually does exist. But that this was a reconstruction that was done in the 90s, taking basically all the available vacuum tubes that were coming back. Because the story was that there were about 12 of these machines. Yeah, actually, Wikipedia has 12. There were 12 of these machines that were created during the war. And after the war, Winston Churchill said, destroy the machines. And what they did was they took the parts
Oh.
out of the machines and used them to rebuild the British telephone network, which had been effectively destroyed during the war, because the British telephone network at that time was using vacuum tubes. So they could take all these vacuum tubes, take all these parts that were being used for Colossus, and put them into use in private sector. So Bomba cracked Enigma and Colossus cracked Lorentz. Exactly. Yes. The real fun part was apparently the Soviets got a bunch of the Lorentz ciphers as a result of they're going into Germany, and nobody told the Soviets that the British and Polish had actually cracked the cipher about 12 years earlier. And so, as a result, the Soviets were using Lorentz for several years because the British were like, yeah, nobody's ever cracked this thing. You should definitely use it. And so they got some free information from there as well. I was just about to ban you for the link, Mike, but
Oh, sorry. My
no, you're
bad.
fine. You're fine. I just saw a huge link. I'm like, oh, time to ban.
That's vacuum tubes. It's not my fault.
$7 for a vacuum tube. So, got that going for you. Do I look like a hardware guy? Yeah, it was actually kind of impressive. And they were talking about some of the mechanisms they used to keep this thing going because, nobody's manufacturing this stuff anymore. Like the vacuum tubes, they're not really being made anymore. So you want to preserve these as long as possible. And so they have this whole warm-up cycle and a cool-down cycle where the actual machine wouldn't have had that. Basically, it just ran 24/7, and you had operators coming in, switching out tapes with the encoded messages, and it would just run for 24 hours a day.
That's where always on comes from.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so that was actually a really cool first day of data relay
That's
because
super cool. I'm a little jealous, actually.
yeah, it was so the museum itself is the same building where a bunch of these Colossus machines were hosted, and let me drop a link to the National Computer Museum
I'm gonna rename my server Colossus.
because they also, in addition, the National Museum of Computing, excuse me, they also had a bunch of other stuff talking about the history of computing and fun things like, oh, here's some Nokia brick phones from the 90s. So going back and getting a little nostalgic, they had an entire room dedicated to the BBC Micro, which was one of the first. Basically, think of it as the TRS-80 of the UK.
Hmm.
So this was one of your early computer kits that was designed for the regular person. So they had a bunch of those. They had some other ones. I snapped a photo of one that I found out was released after I was born. So I thought it was going to be older than me, and it turns out that I'm older by about a month. But it was, yeah. There you go. See, that could be donated. Although you probably still use that. It's your
I mean,
daily.
it's got a cool wolf on it. I wouldn't
That's
donate it.
that's true. That's probably a daily driver phone.
I
Just
could
use
sell
that
it to
all
the
the time.
museum.
But yeah, that was day one, and then this year the path for data relay was kind of a inverted J. So went from Bletchley, Milton Keynes, down to Reading, and then over to Bristol, up to Birmingham, up to Manchester, and that was the 5 days. I would highly recommend if you ever have the opportunity to speak at data relay, do it. Do all 5 days. It is very draining because it's almost like you're a band on the road. Actually, funny thing was the coach driver who was taking us to several of these places thought that we were a band. The band called Delta Relay, and we're like, this is the whitest Mississippi blues band you've ever seen. But he didn't quite understand what we were doing. I think that's the museum that holds a computer the first video game ever made. PDP-1 ran Space Wars. I definitely saw a PDP-8. There might have been a PDP-1. There were also some old computers from the 50s and 60s where you have the gigantic magnetic discs, the magnetic drums for storage. So they definitely had some of that. There might have been a PDP one, but I don't remember. There were a lot of things, and I believe it is a free to open to the public. So if you happen to be in central UK, that's not a bad place to visit. But yeah, data relay, love the event. This was my second time around. Definitely enjoyed it, and would do it a third time if I had the opportunity. Grant Fritchie was also there, so they had their big name, and then they had me. So they had that going for them. And I know Tracy did it a year before me, so she did it I think in 2018. But yeah, if you're ever interested in speaking, Data Relay certainly a very different, very unique event, just because of the traveling roadshow style. So you're helping unpack things, set up the venue, get everything going for the day, pack everything up, get in the bus, drive to the next city, and repeat the next day. It's definitely a lot more work than your average speaking event where speakers roll in on the day of, do their session, and then hop on a flight back home. But, excuse me, also I came back with some Concruft and combined that with my flight, which was today. And so I'm not at 100%, as you could tell from the smoker's voice I've got going on right now. But the show must go on. So that was Data Relay. Yeah, highly recommend. Go do it if you can. A few years back, a few of us, it started out as a joke, and then it became semi-serious. But unfortunately, this was 2019. But we talked about Data Relay US. And my idea was, I want to just go to a bunch of great fried chicken places in the Southeast. And
Yes.
write that off as a conference so it can be a business expense. And so we actually talked seriously. There were a few of us who talked seriously about, all right, well, what areas could reasonably support a data relay? Because you need to have multiple cities that are relatively close to one another, have enough population to where you could reasonably host events and could put it all together. And as a result, there are large areas of the U.S. where the population density just probably wouldn't support it. Even in the Carolinas area, it would be really difficult to pull that off. So, Texas high-speed corridor shuttled at 100 plus miles per hour. You know what? I'd be down for that. That would be barbecue relay.
Closest to the Autobahn.
But yeah, so there were I wouldn't call them serious talks, but they were semi-serious talks. Except that was in 2019, and then 2020 happened, and well, forget it. So if there will ever be a data relay US, I don't know, but it is certainly a fun experience in the UK, and it's a good way to get an event in areas where you're not likely to have a bunch of events normally happen. So good on them. Certainly appreciate all the work that the data relay team puts into this, and the just great job that they do. I know they've been doing it for quite a while. There have been so many people who've cycled in and out of data relay organizers, and it's just kind of carried on as a tradition. So I appreciate that. All right. Next thing, we got to talk about something. People, we have to talk. We have to have a conversation. So this is from Reddit, which means, there's a good chance that it's a lie. But welcome to Reddit. My manager at my new job has implemented a no aliases mandate in any of our production code. I have never heard of this. Do other people not use aliases? My initial response to this is, hello, good sir, your manager is dumb. That's my official response. Your manager is dumb. No aliases. Yeah, you can get away with not using aliases, But the thing is that I'd go no contact with my manager. Yeah, just go rogue on this one. Aliases help with readability of code. Now, there are bad aliases. If you just choose like A, B, and C arbitrarily, then yes, that's a dumb aliasing system and is not going to be very helpful.
That's what my
But
statistician clients do.
yeah, but
And
if you have,
I'm
you don't have to
behind
have
them.
a perfect aliasing system which automatically generates constantly unique table aliases and is absolutely perfect for all scenarios. Just go with first letter of each word in the table name, and you're probably in good shape. There are situations where that may need to change. Okay, change it at that point. But I don't think that you need to have enormous thought and effort put into either an aliasing system or saying no aliasing at all. And I do agree the entire point of aliases is to make code more readable, especially once you get into schema based naming. So if you have schema.table and then you need three-part column naming, and that three-part column naming gets a little bit messy versus a simple alias.column name. I actually thought I would have more of a rant built up for this, but really
Well,
it's a dumb idea.
so
So please,
the reason I had brought it up is because I was doing code review with kind of somebody who is on a. We generally have a team of database developers where we're doing a lot of query writing, right? So um, we have an architect slash DBA programmer who is helping us with Airflow and some architecture work, but also pitching in and reviewing SQL. And he had an interesting take, which I hadn't thought of, which was that in his career, he's seen, situations where there's like schema collisions and, it's hard for him to troubleshoot things because I might say PAT for patient and somebody else uses PT. And then, so I was intrigued by his take on it, and he gave me more. I sent him this Reddit thread, and he gave me some more detailed feedback. But definitely agreed that, especially like sometimes you absolutely have to, right? So if you have one of the things that we have is a date dimension table, because we have this very aggregated data mart that we're using that has a lot of fact tables. So you might have to join date keys. So you have like admission date, discharge date, and you're essentially aliasing the same table. I mean, you absolutely have to do that. So it was an interesting conversation because I hadn't ever heard the pros from the database side of like, well, it's a little easier to troubleshoot if there's fewer aliases. So I thought it was just an interesting take.
yeah, a couple of comments in chat. Solomon says no aliases is an absurd rule. What could be the goal of it? It would make more sense to have a rule stating that aliases are required. I don't know that I would go as far as to say make a rule aliases are required. I know Solomon's not saying that, but yeah, I would be more inclined to say that rule would be better than the no aliases rule. I think the best rule of all is write code that is clear to humans, that is understandable, and does the best job that you can to make it clear and understandable, which usually means using aliases. There might be a circumstance in which I don't want to use an alias. I'd have to think about that. I don't know that I can think of something offhand outside of simple ad hoc querying where I'm just doing a quick select star from table or select top 100 star from table. And I'm probably not going to alias that. But as soon as this is code that is going into a stored procedure that gets checked into source control or is part of some official process, yeah, I'm probably aliasing it at that point. Imagine linked server tables. Yeah, where you have to have all four parts in the name. And also subqueries, Anders mentions. You might get the wrong result if you do not alias. And with certain things like the apply operator, you absolutely need to
You
alias.
have to, yeah.
With common table expressions, you have to provide it a name, which technically you could say, oh, well, the common table expression's name is not an alias. And you can alias the common table expression name if you so desire, which normally I do. So correct result, reusable code, performance. I imagine this guy would also ban CTEs. Maybe. Or would require everything be in CTEs. Using values to provide a list requires an alias. Yeah, that's another circumstance where you have to name the set that you create. Anything invented after SQL version 1 is not legal, which is why Anders only uses the star equal and equal star operators for outer joins. Yeah, sure, they don't actually work anymore, but he still uses it. There's a lot of syntax errors in the code. So yeah, as far as aliasing goes, I think that's not a good take. And I'm not going to bring up the message because there's an actual person's name, but I did want to. Everything before 1776 was a mistake. You're not wrong. You're not
You
wrong.
guys are funny tonight. Co-audience.
So yeah, the comment. I'm going to paraphrase the comment here so that we don't accidentally release the name of the guilty parties. Not this manager. This manager, I don't care who that manager is. That's a dumb take. But what Mike was talking about. So I'm not entirely sure that in a large enterprise scale databases that aliasing actually makes the SQL more readable and easier to debug. I think I disagree with that because in most cases, imagine that you've got a few classes of query. You have big monster queries, you have fairly small queries, and you've got something that fits in between. Well, for big monster queries, I certainly want to alias because if you have schema name dot table name dot column name, you've got a long column name or a long name to describe what this column is. And then if I alias it, I drop off schema name dot table name, which is a lot of repetitive code. It's a lot easier, I think, for a person to scan and see PAT or P versus A, P for patient, A for admission, D for discharge. Let's stick with something real simple like that. It is easier for me to note the difference between P dot and DBO dot patient dot or DBO dot admission dot, especially if you pick two tables where they have the same length in the name, or if you have a lot of tables where they're very long names, which are like patient admission record after a certain date, patient admission record before a certain date, patient admission record post-admission process, patient admission record post-transfer process. If you've got that kind of monstrosity naming, which may make sense, but
We do.
in that case, that can be really hard for a person to read and quickly differentiate. Oh, right, this is patient admission process post-transfer and not patient admission process post-admission from other venue. And by contrast, if you alias that, it's a little easier, I think, for a human to catch that short difference. So I do disagree with that part of the point. Yes, when you have multiple programmers, you have multiple aliasing styles, and I don't mind that because unless you're talking, even if you're talking about enormous queries, you're going to want to start with the from clause, and you're going to want to figure out, okay, well, what are the aliases? What are the table names, and what are the aliases? So you drive from the from clause. That should be the first thing that you're looking at in the query, and then to any joins, and that's going to give you whatever the person chose as aliasing names. And unless you have people who pick really poor aliasing names, I don't think there are going to be enormous differences. To the to the extent that one person says PAT and the other person says P, that's pretty easy to figure out because you just say, oh, in this query, patient is P.
Right. And we actually are good employees, and we actually have a standard. So we all use the same aliases. It's like, 'cause there are a lot of us. I mean, so there's probably 300 SQL users within the hospital system because it's a big enterprise, right? And there's about 20 of us that kind of have similar roles, and we've all agreed on standards, which
Right.
is useful. But in my pharmaceutical days, I mean, it was me and three other people who had full access to the database, which is why I ended up dropping a table and not knowing what I was doing. But there wasn't that many people with those kind of technical skills. But in a larger group like this, we do actually have a standard.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you do have standards at a company, then okay, so be it. Yeah, I tend to be a little bit more lax about that. But uh, if you're at a place where there are official standards, then that's fine. Now, Anders does say from sales A enter join employee B. Yeah, that's a bad example. That's the kind of aliasing where you get the ruler and smack on the wrist. Like this is not helpful. This is actually harmful for aliasing because aliasing should make life easier. And yeah, you can make life harder with aliasing, especially if you pick really really bad aliasing names. Like you switch discharge and admission so that the alias for admission is discharge and the alias for discharge is admission.
Yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, yeah. So half the time when that happens, it's because somebody had the query wrong the first time, and they're like, "Oh, actually, I need to get the admission date as opposed to the discharge date," and so they just switch the table name underneath and leave the alias the same. That's no, that's not a good idea.
Wrong.
Now, this does also lead to another thing that Mike mentioned: Control F replace. Uh, I've seen some weird Control F replaces in the past, especially regular expression based
But in some
replaces.
IDEs, if you double click on like if you're one good thing about being consistent with your aliasing as well is if you're working on big monster code and it's ADE or the alias is PAT, you can highlight all the inferences of that, which I like by double clicking on stuff.
That's true. You can do that in Azure Data Studio. I think you can do that in Management Studio as well. I think it'll show up that way. Certainly, if you do a Control H to find and replace, Control F replace equals proto ETL. You're not moving. You're not really moving anything, but I like where you're going. So that's no aliases policy. Actually, there's a follow-on. You don't program in Notepad or VI. I mean, sometime I have in the past programmed in both Notepad and in Vim. I have had to do small amounts of development in VI proper as opposed to Vim, but I am one of those lazy millennials who doesn't use proper VI and just relies on Vim to do 80% of the work for me. And I don't even have the 7 keys on my keyboard necessary to run Emacs. I don't even have a meta key.
Is Edlin a type of Emacs?
I don't know what Edlin is. You got me, Anders. I'm going to Google Edlin. It is a line
It's like
editor.
the Viking. It's like the Viking Vim.
So Edline, the only text editor provided with early versions of IBM PC DOS, MS-DOS, and OS/2. So that was replaced by edit.com. Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. So being a line editor, I wonder if it behaved more like sed, where that's a stream editor, but don't know.
It ran on PDP 39.
Well, I had that going for it. It was better than VI at the time. It's amazing what 4 decades will do for a program. Wait a minute. Emacs not ASCII or Unicode? What 6 keys are missing? So the Emacs keyboard. Let me see if I can get a good. Let me see if I can get a good picture of this. But there were. You have to remember at the time when Emacs had come out. Emacs is just a text editor. Well, I mean, not just a text editor. So, you could use ASCII, ANSI. You could use Unicode. It's not a naming style, but they expected certain keys, like a meta key, a left alt, a right alt, which were different behaviors, and the cuckoo's egg. So this one may be good. So this is the Space Cadet keyboard. I'll share the screenshot for this. So this is the Space Cadet keyboard, which was the first thing that popped up when I was looking for fancy keyboards that worked well with Emacs. And you have all of these keys on the left-hand side. Hyper, super, meta, control, top,
Whoa.
Greek shift, alt mode, rub out, which might get you banned from Twitch, network system term. So you have all of these different extra keys in addition to your standard QWERTY keyboard. And on the right-hand side, you had meta, you had alt lock, super, hyper, etc. So you have all of these extra keys that are available because Emacs had a series of key bindings where it'd be like, in order to insert this macro, you would use right meta plus control shift plus hyper plus X. And that would do some really fancy thing. So if you had all of these extra keys available to you, it's got a thumbs up key, so it was built for social media. But it's got a thumbs down key as well, so they probably would ban it from YouTube. And then
It's the ASCII 0.
It's also got the I'm with stupid keys. So you have these 2 keys right here. I'm with stupid.
That's the official ASCII value.
But in any event, this type of keyboard, not exactly this keyboard, but this style was much more common 40 years ago. And when Emacs was at its peak in popularity, even 30 years ago, you tended to have keyboards that were more terminal-like. I think Anders mentioned the VT52. And if I can pull up an image of a VT52 keyboard. So this is a VT102, which is just a little bit different. But you don't have quite as many fancy keys on here, though there is a line feed key, so you got that going for you. So this one might not have been quite as nice. The 102 is probably more timely. Okay, this one probably would not have been as nice for Emacs, just because you don't see the meta keys, you don't see the super keys. Meta and super were the 2 that were really important, and you could emulate those in the standard 104 key layout, but it got a little bit more difficult to work with than if you had separate specific keys for them. So yeah, that's the line behind Emacs. If you have that kind of a keyboard, you could do some amazing things in Emacs. I spent more time in VI and Vim than I did in Emacs. It was easier for me to understand, but I will not knock Emacs as a lifestyle, because it's not really a text editor. It is more of a lifestyle. You either live your life in Emacs or you use other tools. And that was just the way that it was. That, yeah, I am Emacs man. If I need to send an email, I'll send it from Emacs. If I need to update a website,
Read
I'll do it from
books. They
Emacs.
read books.
Yeah,
It's amazing. Yeah.
talk to my psychiatrist because Emacs had built-in ELIZA. So you could have a conversation where the computer would keep asking you, yes, but how does that make you feel? Totally serious. Emacs did have a built-in therapist. Let me see if I can find the link for it. I remember playing with this, the Emacs Doctor. Um, yeah, Emacs Doctor. Okay, so it used ELIZA. It needed it. Yeah,
Is
if
that a
you were
palindrome? It needed it.
if you were a heavy Emacs user, yeah, maybe you did need it. But the Emacs psychiatrist uses ELIZA, natural language processing chatbot that was 30 some years old. By the way, there is nothing new under the sun. And describe your problems, type return twice, and then basically you type in all this stuff. It's like, well, why do you say blah blah blah? What makes you feel this way? So it's just kind of fun. That was built in, and I believe that the command was meta x doctor. Or you could use the -nw flag. Yeah, here we go. Meta x doctor to launch ELIZA. So escape, type X, and then doctor. So yeah, meta was replaced with escape, but escape is really hard to hit as a key when you're typing. Was there ever a POSIX, Emacs Fusion, or combination of standardized, or did they just fork it forever and you either used Emacs or VI? Andrew says, I think the Civil War is still on. Probably. I would say that you have some people who will still swear by Emacs, but those people are very crusty. I don't think you have a new generation of Emacs users. Granted, you probably don't have a new generation of VI users either, because the easy way out was to use Nano or some text or some graphical editor. But yeah, Emacs and VI definitely there was during the 90s there was a lot of infighting about which one was better. I mean, it was like when I during the 90s I was a kid and it was Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis and you had these arguments about which one is better. Well, the adults had the same argument except it was Emacs and VI. And so was there ever a POSIX version or did they just fork it forever? So Emacs was one of the early bits of software released under the GPL. VI, I believe, was as well. And so you did have official versions of Emacs and VI, which would work across different flavors of Unix or Linux. And I'm sure that they had to do some things to get it to work in BSD rather than in Linux or the 3 different flavors of BSD. They would have had to recompile it, but it was the same code for each one of those. So, short answer is yes. There were official versions of both. Was there ever an attempt to combine the two? No, because you had a lot of overlap, and it didn't make sense because the style of interacting was very different. Emacs is a lot like Emacs has its origins, I'd say, in teletype and terminal style interactions. VI has its origins in the Corn shell, which was a competitor to Bash, and just the Bourne shell, so SH and then Bash. KSH, the Corn shell, that one very similar to VI in that instead of using arrow keys, you used letter keys on the keyboard, J, K, L, and I, to move around. You had a lot of commands that were 2-3 characters long and intended to perform some operation on the entire line or on a paragraph or on a set of lines. So you were really driving toward using the keys, the main keys on the keyboard, versus Emacs, which was taking advantage of these additional keys to perform outside operations, things that were a little bit harder to do on a 104 key keyboard, but were a lot easier to do on a keyboard like the one I showed where you had a bunch of extra keys. And yeah, if you had GCC on your OS, then you could compile either one. I'd say that was probably a fair bet. There might have been some weird edge case where you couldn't, but I'd say probably. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about, also related to the prior story about aliases, and this comes from Mike, and it's a question of whether or not people use fully qualified object names. So, or under what circumstances do you use fully qualified object names? Yeah, derailing worked really well there. You get me started on Emacs, and I will show you the limits of my ignorance. And then we went like 10 minutes beyond the limits of my ignorance. But fully qualified names, database.schema.object. Do you use those? My short answer is generally no, unless you need to. If you're talking a cross database query, then yes. If I have to hit across databases, I need to specify the database. If I cross servers, I need to specify the server. So you have a 4-part name. If we're talking about within the same database, no. Drop database. Do keep schema. Do keep object. Hard to do when you have 1,200 copies of the same DB on one server. Yeah, in that case, you don't really want to switch over. So a couple of things. One is, if your code is in source control, you definitely don't want to have hard-coded database names in most situations. If you're using something like Visual Studio Project with deployment scripts, you can code the variable name. So you could have systemdb or let's say static DB or user DB or whatever vague essentially alias for the database that you wanted to use. And at deployment script time using SQL command, we could replace that alias, that variable, with the actual value of the database and deploy out that code to any one of the 1,200 databases. Dynamic SQL. Yeah, Dynamic SQL would also do the job. But if you hard-code a database name, then if you have that code in a project, in a database project, you are really locking yourself in on using that database name. Which means if you have a test database, if you restore it to another database name and you want to try something out, most of your code is not only going to not work the way that you expect, but could actually give you really bad consequences. Because if you're inserting into database.schema.object and you think you're inserting into your test database, but your code is hard-coded to include the database name, you're really inserting into your prod database or your real database, and that could be a problem. So there are real risks to having that database name in the query. I've dealt with a few third-party apps that required a specific name of the database. Suspect this was why. Yeah, most likely. So don't do that. Do, however, say schema.object. And the reason for this is, shouldn't prod and dev be segregated well enough to keep that from happening? In a normal circumstance, yes. But the scenario that I would think of is you have your prod database, somebody does an oopsie, accidentally performs an update without a where clause or something like that. And you want to take data from that database from earlier in the day before the oopsie. You restore the database and then you want to migrate data over, but maybe you want to perform a quick test first. And you're calling a procedure on what you think is the restore database that is querying the restore database. But if you hard code the database name in there, then you're hitting the current real database as opposed to the restoration. I think you'd be surprised how many in-house devs have dev, QA, and prod on the same SQL instance. Yeah, I could believe that as well. A lot of companies, a lot of shops will do that.
You're not supposed to.
You shouldn't, because you should have them be in separate environments, because there are environmental settings which you would want to test in a dev environment or a QA environment before you roll it into production. Isn't the fundamental underlying SQL engine shared then? Yeah, yeah. So you could have a noisy neighbor in QA that affects your prod environment, your prod database. That would be the least of your concerns. Yeah. Yes, there are big problems to the idea. I mean, this is not something that you would want to do. Generally, you would at least want to have separate named instances for different environments. I would prefer to have separate SQL Server installations on different virtual machines or different physical machines per environment. But there are companies that will put dev, test, prod on the same machine to save money. And in most of those companies, the developers are SA on the box too. I mean, it's just cherry on top. So don't do that. Public service announcement, don't do that.
But you should put AdventureWorks in your production database, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, AdventureWorks is very critical data that you could join and enhance your existing data using the powers of data science.
That's a little joke. I was watching one of Kevin's videos.
Pubs. The Pubs database could work as well. Just don't put wide world importers in production.
Well, thank you. That helps. So you would do use in the beginning of your comment. You said something. You said something like data update, or what did you say? Like I'll have to rewatch the tape, but you essentially do a use statement. So if I'm writing queries and you're saying a best practice is schema dot objects,
Yep.
then I can qualify, use, this database, semicolon, and then go on with my life using the two part.
There we go. No, I just want to share my window. I want to share Notepad. There we go. Here's your Notepad, Anders. So what I'm talking about, we have select star from, all right, I'll do it this way. Database 1 dot schema 1 dot table 1 t. I aliased it. Look at you, tabbed Notepad. Yeah, this is fancy Notepad. It's also got Zoom, so it's very fancy Notepad. Only the best for me. So here's the problem. There are multiple problems. One problem is that if I have a procedure, update t set x equals something from where I don't know, x is greater than 3. Let's pick that. And let's say that I create a procedure, do important work as update t set x equals 1 from database 1 dot schema 1 dot table 1 t where x is greater than 3. And let's say that I run this from database 1, do important work. Cool, everything works is fine. I say, yeah, life is good. Life is good. But let's say that I restore this to database restore 1 because either I'm testing something out or I need to get some data. This is a little bit of a contrived scenario, but if I execute this stored procedure on database restore 1, it will update database 1 because I have hard-coded the database name. Not what we want. Not a good outcome. So, for that reason, among others, there are other reasons why I would want to remove this database name. If I am performing work within the database, SP_procs would behave very strange, yes. If I want to perform work just within the database, I want to alias schema.table. Now, if I absolutely need to cross databases, like I have some static DB, and I need to cross databases in my procedure, then I would alias db.schema.table. Although I may also wonder, is there a better way to do this? Can I create a procedure within static DB that would do important work versus having it happen within this database? That's a slightly different question, but moral of the story, if I do not specify the database here, I actually get the behavior that I expect. If I do specify the database, I can get invalid behavior. Also, if I were to check this into source control and I specify database1.schema1.table1, if you're using a Visual Studio database project, this will give you an error. It's going to say, hey, you shouldn't be using database names. You should instead create a variable that at runtime will be replaced with whatever the value of this is. So for my deployment, I could say, deployment, fill in this variable name with this database name. Or maybe I fill it in with this database name for that deployment. So that's why database shouldn't be included unless you're talking about a cross-database query. Schema, I would say, should be included. And here's the reason. There are two reasons. Number one, if you do not specify a schema, by default, SQL Server will first look at DBO. Let me check.
I didn't know that.
SQL Server will first look at your schema. That's right. So it'll look for, like, if my username is Feasel, it'll look for, is there a schema associated with me, or that I am the owner of? If I am the owner of the some schema, it'll start with that and then look for a table 1, and it'll say, oh, okay, that doesn't exist, so let me look at DBO. And then if it says, oh, I can't find DBO, you get a syntax error. So by specifying the schema name, you are basically removing one lookup. That one lookup doesn't save you much per call, but if you're doing this hundreds of millions of times per day, then it can add up a little bit. You may be talking about a few microseconds, potentially remove one lookup. Yeah, a few microseconds, but where it gets really nice is that sometimes you have a sadist like me who has schema1.table1 and dbo.table1.
Oh, no.
But that can be perfectly reasonable because I might have something like, let's say, history.table1, where I'm storing historical information of that table. Or I might have something like staging, where the structure may actually be different. I could have a staging dimension where the input structure looks like whatever I'm getting from my source system, and then I'll have a final dimension which is the Kimball style. So it's perfectly valid to have multiple schemas in SQL Server with the same final table name. In which case, you absolutely need to specify the two-part name, because otherwise, if you just specify this, it is first going to look, do you have ownership of a schema? No? Okay. Let me look at DBO then. But if you happen to have ownership of the staging schema, then update t set x equals 1 from table 1, we'll actually update the schema or we'll update the staging table as opposed to the DBO table. So always specify schema name. Object name is required. Also, there are situations in which you must specify the schema name. I believe in-memory OLTP requires that you specify a schema name. There are probably other products which require that you specify the schema name. Temporal tables, I don't know if they require that, but maybe they do. So there are a couple of features at least which do necessitate including the schema name. But I think it is a good practice because, yeah, you can shave off a microsecond or two by not having to do an unnecessary lookup. But you can also prevent a possible error of understanding if you have multiple tables with different schemas, but the same underlying name. Whereas including database name is almost always a mistake, except if you're doing a cross-database query. And then I guess the follow-up question is, does that really need to be a cross-database query? Do you really have to have this be in separate databases? And if you're querying across databases, does that make sense? The answer could still be yes.
Yeah, for us it is yes, because there's a lockdown database that's kind of controlled by the vendor, and then we have kind of our own schemas where we have a little bit more control. So it might be like, if I'm going to make my own table, it might be like this schema / Mike, and then I have to go database schema object for the thing that I'm trying to get. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of that, and that's kind of why I brought it up, because it's a little different in Oracle. Sorry I said the O word, but I'm just trying to pick your brain about it, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. So Solomon says, if I remember correctly, specifying schema name is actually faster, slightly faster than just the object name by itself. Tracing the connection, there was quite a bit more locking and unlocking when not specifying the schema name, so faster and less error prone. Yes, you're right. That's where I was talking about. It's a few microseconds faster because you don't have to do the lookup to see, does your login own a schema, or to which schema is your login associated? And it doesn't have to do that lookup and check to see if there is a table with your associated login schema before checking DBO or the default schema as owned by the database owner, because you could go wild and have that be some other schema as the default instead of DBO and really mess with people. Of course, if you make everyone DBO and all objects in the DBO schema, then things technically still work, but that sounds painful. Basically, you've reintroduced SQL Server 2000 style schema logic, Anders. Yeah, the pre-2005 ways.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
He was on the same wavelength.
Yep. Like, look, schemas, I like the way that they moved schemas in 2005 and switched it from associate with the user and more of associate with a concept, because I like the idea of having a bundle of tables that are logically combined together as part of a schema, because that makes a lot of sense. And so where instead of it being associated with your user, it is associated with an idea. But SQL Server is usually pretty good about maintaining backwards compatibility, which means they're going to have that old style of, well, what if the person really does have a schema that they own, the Mike schema, and there's a Mike.table1, and that's the table that they're looking for. So we'll look for Mike.table1 first. It'll say, oh, there is no table Mike.table1. So let me go back to what is the default schema of the database owner, which almost all the time, unless you're crazy and change it, is DBO. And I think that's going to be the reason for the locking and unlocking when you're not specifying the schema name that Solomon mentions, because you're going and you're looking up what is that logins owned schema, and then checking in system tables to see if there is a valid table by that name and in that schema. So that's the big reason why in SQL Server we always want to specify the schema name. We always want to specify the object name. We have to. And we almost never want to specify the database name. Same thing with the server name. You have to do that if you're doing a link server query, but otherwise you don't want to get in the habit of specifying this for, especially if server 1 is the server that you're on, because now you have to set up some weird loopback stuff, which I have done, is not pretty. Technically, their default schema. User can own multiple schemas, I believe. I think you may be right. I think I am thinking of the default schema. But it is a thing that was really intended more for that SQL Server 2000 outlook versus 2005 and later, where schemas switched to more of a less of a security mechanism and more of a functionality. But nonetheless, we have somehow survived an entire hour. So I'm going to wind things down so that hopefully I can rest the voice a little bit and sound a little better soon. Schema is still just x.x500 style DB, right? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Enhanced QC. Because the schema in SQL Server 2005 and later ideas, schema is really a logical grouping of tables that fit together for some relevant purpose. By default, DBO is essentially your dumping ground for tables. But if you choose to use schemas, you would typically do things like staging.tables or ETL.tables or loading.tables or history.tables or lookup.tables. And these would more or less bundle together a group of tables that are somewhat related to one another, at least in terms of the function they fulfill. There's no strict requirement in that they have to be related to each other. It's more of the a standard that individuals can apply to make their lives a little easier. What exactly are the effects by partition by schema and also by database? Are the order important? Partition by schema and also by database. I'm not sure I understand what the question is there. Not exactly sure what you mean by that. But Anders does say it can make security easier with granting permissions to a schema. Yes, you can do that, yeah. And you could have your ETL people only get access to certain schemas. I have done that in the past. That is closer to that 2000 style of schemas being a security mechanism versus a functionality mechanism. But you can do that, yeah. And especially combining it with roles, where certain roles get access to certain schemas. HR specifically in many databases, like denying people access to data that they shouldn't see. Yeah. So Keone, if you want to follow up with that question, I can stick around for another minute or two, but like I said, I'm not quite sure what you meant by the question. So what I will say in the meantime, or just use row level security. Actually, row level security, there was the 6th article in that series from Redgate. It was a good one. We just didn't get to it tonight. But quick note for programming purposes. Over the next few weeks, tomorrow we have Azure SQL Database Business Continuity, which is going to be online. That's our advanced DBA group. That is Jess Schultz, who's going to be talking to us about that. Next Tuesday, so the 17th, we will be in person at Tech Systems, also online. And Tayob Ali will talk to us about applying Azure Monitor log data for Azure resources. And our own Rick Pack will do the Data Science and Business Intelligence meeting, the last one of the year, on October 24th, talking to us a little bit about Kaggle outliers and surprises in some work that he's done. So I'm a new learner. I remember hearing my lecturer saying that creating an account in SQL Server, we choose to start with a schema or with a database, something like that. Maybe it's granting rights. I don't know. I think I'd have to hear the context to understand the specific details. You can grant a person... Oh, it could be an Oracle versus SQL issue. That might be possible. Because you can grant a person as owner of a schema, which I would normally wouldn't do. Said the O word, banned. That's fair. That's fair. I should ban Anders. Just on general principle. Dispensation. Anders has bought indulgences. Cursors every... Well, you just lost your indulgences, Anders. So you can assign somebody as an owner of a schema. I don't recommend it. It usually causes you more pain than it's worth. But as far as starting with schema or starting with database, yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to hear the context behind it to tell you for sure. But unfortunately, my voice is giving out now, so I am going to have to call it for this evening. Thanks again, everybody, for stopping by. We will have Shop Talk in 2 weeks. Can I ask whether previous videos can be rewatched? Absolutely. So shoptalk.tripass.org is where we have all of the previous episodes of Shop Talk archived. It is also on our YouTube channel, so you can... All the videos are up there, but basically this gives you some show notes, some quick ideas. And are any of them related to interviews? We don't tend to do interviews so much on Shop Talk. There are other podcasts and the like that do that. This is just more of bloviating than interviewing. So there have been a couple of cases where we've had a special guest and have kind of not really done an interview, but have talked a little bit about a particular topic. This is more of Stump the Chump. Yeah, it kind of is, yes. And usually we come up with our own ways of stumping ourselves. So shoptalk.tripass.org, that has all the show notes. It has all the prior episodes. That goes back to 2020. So as you'd imagine, there's quite a bit of content back there. And with that, I'm going to wrap this up for tonight. So until we see each other again, everyone, take care. VI for life. I'll get down with that. VI for life. See you all later.